Victoria Harper had always been a woman of resilience. From the moment she found out she was pregnant with Ethan, her life had been defined by struggle. She was a single mother, living in a small apartment in Los Angeles, working 2 jobs just to make ends meet. The city, with its sprawling skyline and endless opportunities, always felt so far out of reach. Victoria wasn't a part of that world. She wasn't the kind of woman who could afford a latte at a trendy cafe or shop for designer clothes. She was the woman at the bottom, struggling to give her son a future that didn't mirror the hardships she'd known. Every night, she would lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, wondering how much longer she could hold on. The bills piled up faster than she could pay them, and the fear of eviction haunted her. But what hurt the most was watching Ethan, her bright, sweet boy, go to bed hungry sometimes. He didn't know it yet, but his mother was drowning. She had tried everything she could think of, from taking on extra shifts to scrimping on groceries. Nothing was working. She had no way out. One evening, as she scrolled through her phone, Victoria saw an ad that changed everything. An auction. It was absurd. It was dehumanizing. But it was also an opportunity. The ad promised a way out of the mess she was in, an auction where wealthy men could buy women to carry their child. The concept was shocking, even more so when she read the details. It wasn't just about carrying a child. It was about securing financial stability for the future. It's about giving her son a chance at a life she could never provide. Desperation and the love for her child led Victoria to make a decision. She never thought she would. She would do anything for Ethan, even if it meant giving up a part of herself in the process. With a heavy heart, she signed up, knowing that her life was about to change forever. Victoria arrived at the venue, her stomach a knot of anxiety. The building was towering, imposing, and filled with men whose lives were worlds apart from her own. This wasn't a charity event or a business gala. This was something darker, something she never imagined she would be part of. As she stepped into the opulent hall, her eyes were immediately drawn to the high ceilings, the glimmering chandeliers, and the cold, indifferent faces of the guests. She was told to stay composed, to smile, to be invisible. But no matter how much she tried to blend in, she felt like an exhibit in a zoo, a rare piece of art on display. Judged by eyes that saw her as nothing more than an object to be bought, the auction was about to begin. Victoria stood at the back, feeling like a cog in a machine she never agreed to be part of. I had spent days preparing for this moment, rehearsing what she would say if asked to speak. But now, standing in front of the crowd, she felt powerless. The event organizer, a man dressed in a crisp suit, took the microphone. His voice smooth and polished, listing the qualities of the women they were about to auction off like livestock. Exotic beauty, strong will, potential to bear a child, he said with a rehearsed tone, painting a picture that felt more like an object than a person. The words echoed in Victoria's mind. Potential to bear a child. That was all she was now. Her name echoed through the room. Victoria Harper, number 5. She stepped forward, her legs trembling beneath her as she climbed the stage. The bright lights blurred her vision, and the silence in the room was deafening. All eyes were on her, some filled with curiosity, others with hunger. She could feel the weight of the moment press down on her, each second dragging her further from who she was before. She was no longer just a mother trying to provide for her son. In this moment, she was a commodity. $1 million. A voice suddenly cut through the stillness, and all eyes turned to the man in the back. His dark eyes locked onto hers, and she felt a chill run down her spine. The man was tall, with an air of power that immediately commanded the room. Kareem Al-Fad, a man known for his wealth and discretion. Victoria swallowed hard. Her fate was sealed. Victoria sat in the private room, her fingers trembling as she held the contract in front of her. The words blurred together, and she struggled to focus, her mind racing with conflicting thoughts. Kareem stood across the room, his gaze fixed on her with an intensity that made her feel small. She had signed the contract, her heart heavy with the weight of the decision she had made. This wasn't what she wanted, but she had no choice. The reality of her situation sank in deeper as she glanced down at the fine print. $1 million. For a child, She was to bear Kareem's heir, and once the baby was born, she would leave, just like that. Her child, her flesh and blood, would belong to him, and she would be nothing more than a surrogate. "You knew what you were agreeing to," Kareem said, his voice cold, but not unkind. He stood with his arms crossed, his expression unreadable. "This is the deal. You get the money, and once the child is born, you walk away. No attachments, no strings." The words hung in the air, and Victoria fought to steady her breathing. She couldn't do this, not to herself, and certainly not to her son. Yet deep down, she knew she had no choice. The mounting debt, the constant struggle to put food on the table, the fear of losing her home, those were the reasons she was here now. Trapped in a contract she had no power to escape. Victoria set the contract down slowly, her fingers digging into the paper as she stood up, her heart pounding in her chest. She wanted to scream, to refuse, but her voice caught in her throat. This was the only way out. Kareem approached her then, his hand outstretched. "Tomorrow we begin," he said, as if this was just another transaction, another day in his life. But for her, it felt like the beginning of something far darker. With a deep breath, Victoria took his hand, knowing her life would never be the same again. The following days at Kareem's mansion felt like a strange, dreamlike blur to Victoria. The grand halls, with their marble floors and crystal chandeliers, seemed a world away from the worn-down apartment she had left behind. I'd been brought here under the terms of the contract, a mere pawn in a game she hadn't fully understood when she signed her name. But the reality of her situation was undeniable now. She was living in a gilded cage surrounded by wealth and luxury. But it felt as though every step she took was tethered to the heavy burden of the choice she had made. Kareem's presence was constant, though not as domineering as she had expected. He was there when she woke up, watching from the door as she sipped her coffee in silence. He was there when she went to the garden, his gaze always lingering in the background, never too close but never too far either. It was as though he was studying her, measuring her, waiting for something to happen. Victoria, on the other hand, tried to focus on the small comforts of the mansion, the peaceful garden, the warmth of the sun on her face during walks, the soft silk sheets that replaced the rough fabric of her old bed. Yet the underlying fear never left. She had promised herself she would get through this. For her son. For his future, the thought of the baby she was carrying, growing inside her, made her heart ache. She would never truly be the child's mother, and that realization filled her with an overwhelming sadness. How could she leave her own child behind? But that was the deal, the agreement. And Victoria wasn't sure if there was any way out of it. Still, as the days went by, she found herself questioning the life she had stepped into. Was this really the only way to ensure a better life for her son? Or had she made a mistake that she couldn't undo? Every morning she woke up, knowing her life was no longer her own. But somehow, in the silence of the mansion, she began to wonder if there was a chance for something more than the contract. Maybe, just maybe, there could be a future beyond the deal she had made. Days passed. And with each one, Victoria grew more accustomed to the imposing but strangely comforting routine of the mansion. The staff was always polite, almost too kind, treating her as if she were royalty, something she found both comforting and unsettling. Despite the luxury surrounding her, she couldn't escape the gnawing emptiness that seemed to settle deep in her chest every time she looked out at the sprawling estate. The price of her freedom? Kareem, however, remained distant. His presence in her daily life was palpable, yet he remained emotionally closed off. A man of few words, and even fewer personal gestures. Access to the best medical care, and all the luxuries she could ever need, but nothing more. There were no attempts to connect beyond their professional relationship, and as time went on, that suited Victoria just fine. She was here for a purpose, not for friendship or companionship. Still, there were moments when he would look at her in a way that made her feel like he was seeing something more than the woman he had bought. A fleeting glance, a brief moment of concern when she looked unwell, a rare word of encouragement when she seemed lost in thought. But each time, it was as though the wall he had built around himself reappeared just as quickly, cold and unyielding. Victoria, on the other hand, found herself slowly changing. The initial anger and resentment had given way to something else. She still hated the circumstances that had brought her here, but she was beginning to understand that this wasn't all about money. It was about survival. It was about her son, her future. With each passing day, she couldn't help but wonder, could she ever break through the emotional wall Kareem had built? Or would she forever remain a prisoner to the contract, caught between duty and the life she truly wanted? UCSU vit benang ting and UNA vit theo vin fong siagi mead weeks passed, and Victoria began to notice subtle changes in her perception of the mansion and its master. What once seemed like a gilded cage started to take on a different shape, almost like a place where the walls weren't as suffocating as she had originally thought. The house, though luxurious and overwhelming, had moments of warmth. It wasn't just the designer furniture or the marble floors, but the little things. The sound of the wind through the trees outside, the way the light flickered softly through the windows in the early morning hours, casting gentle shadows across the expansive walls. The mansion, for all its grandeur, had a quiet soul of its own, and for a brief moment, she could feel herself belonging to it in some strange way. Kareem, on the other hand, remained as elusive as ever. His presence was always there, looming in the background, but he kept his distance. He didn't attempt to understand her, nor did he make any efforts to comfort her. He simply existed as the man who had purchased her, who had made an agreement that neither of them had truly wanted. She had come to accept it, though. He was the businessman, the man who did what he had to do, and she was the woman caught in the web of it all. But there were flashes of something more teeny, glimmers of vulnerability she caught during the rare moments when he thought no one was watching. A fleeting glance that softened when she spoke of her son, the way his posture relaxed ever so slightly when she asked about the welfare of her family. It wasn't much, but it made her wonder if there was more to him than the cold, calculating businessman he appeared to be. Still, she held her ground. She wasn't here to form emotional bonds. She was here for a purpose, as much as the tiny cracks in Kareem's exterior intrigued her. She knew better than to get too close. And yet, as the days wore on, Victoria couldn't help but feel the stirrings of a connection. Something that felt both dangerous and inevitable. As time went on, Victoria found herself becoming more aware of the subtle yet undeniable shift in her relationship with Kareem. He wasn't the ruthless, cold figure she had once assumed him to be. At moments rare, fleeting, that showed a different side to him. One evening, while she was sitting by the large windows in the library, lost in her own thoughts, Kareem had quietly entered, his footsteps barely audible on the polished floors. Without a word, he had sat down across from her, his eyes briefly meeting hers before he turned his attention to the book in front of him. It was a quiet moment, but there was something in the way he carried himself, vulnerability that she hadn't noticed before. Kareem, for all his wealth and control, seemed to carry an invisible weight. The mansion, with its towering walls and impeccable decor, didn't feel as cold as it once did. Why had he chosen this path, instead of following the typical rigid expectations of his family? She wasn't sure if she was looking for answers for him or for herself, but the question lingered. One afternoon, as they sat in the garden, he had spoken more than usual, sharing small fragments of his past that gave her insight into the man he truly was. He spoke of his parents, his mother's sudden death, his father's distant nature, and how he had been forced to take on the mantle of responsibility at a young age. Victoria listened, the walls between them lowering as she saw a glimpse of the man he might have been without the weight of his legacy. For the first time, she realized that their lives had more in common than she had ever imagined. Both were driven by duty, but both carried unspoken burdens. Despite the growing understanding between them, Victoria still couldn't shake the fear that once their contract ended, so would their connection. But for now, she allowed herself to feel the quiet intimacy that was slowly unfolding between them, one unspoken word at a time. The days began to blur together as Victoria settled into her new life in Kareem's world. What had once seemed like an impossible arrangement was slowly becoming a familiar routine. Despite the underlying tension of their contract, there was a growing sense of normalcy. The mansion, once an intimidating place of luxury and cold formality, was beginning to feel like home, at least in small, unexpected ways. Kareem's presence, though often reserved, was no longer just an imposing figure. He had become a constant, and for the first time in a long while, Victoria felt as though she wasn't facing everything alone. One evening, while they sat together on the terrace overlooking the garden, Victoria couldn't help but feel the weight of her emotions. The stars above twinkled softly, but there was a heaviness in the air. Kareem was beside her, his usual stoic demeanor softened by the quiet of the night. There was something about his silence that spoke volumes. For the first time, he wasn't just the man who had bought her at an auction. He wasn't just the powerful businessman. In this moment, he was a man, sitting next to her, sharing the same night, the same space. "I never thought I'd end up here," Kareem finally spoke, his voice low but steady. "But then life has a way of changing things when you least expect it." Victoria turned to look at him, surprised by his vulnerability. She wasn't used to seeing this side of him. For so long, he had maintained an air of control, as if his life was planned out by rules and expectations. But now, in the quiet of the night, he was speaking of things he had never shared before. "I didn't expect it either," Victoria replied softly, "but I'm starting to think that maybe I've found something here, something I wasn't looking for." There was a long pause between them, the tension between the obligations of their contract and the growing connection they were, both feeling hung in the air. But in that moment, it didn't seem to matter as much. They were here, together, and for once, Victoria allowed herself to wonder if this unexpected connection could evolve into something more. Victoria couldn't ignore the growing tension between her and Kareem, despite the unexpected bond that was forming between them. The mansion, once a place of isolation and coldness, had started to feel like a refuge in its own way. But the looming question of what would happen once their contract ended kept gnawing at her. Was she really starting to fall for a man who had once been a stranger, someone who had bought her with the promise of an heir? Could something real emerge from such an unnatural beginning? One afternoon, after a quiet lunch in the garden, Kareem sat beside Victoria on a bench, watching the wind move through the trees. His gaze was distant, thoughtful, as if the weight of his own thoughts was too much to bear. For a moment, Victoria hesitated, unsure of how to approach him. But then she spoke, her voice softer than she intended. "Kareem, do you ever wonder about us?" she asked, her words hanging in the air between them. He turned his head slowly, meeting her eyes. There was no judgment in his gaze, only understanding. As if he had been expecting this question all along, took a deep breath before responding. "I don't know what to call it, Victoria," he admitted, his voice low. "This arrangement, our connection, is complicated. But in all honesty, I never thought I would be this invested." The honesty in his words struck her more deeply than she expected. He had always been so careful with his emotions, so guarded. To hear him speak so openly about his feelings was a rare vulnerability that made her heart flutter with something she couldn't quite explain. "I didn't expect any of this either," Victoria replied, her voice thick with emotion. "But now, it feels like there's more to this than just a contract. I'm starting to care about you, more than I thought I would." For the first time, they shared a moment of true clarity, silent understanding that, despite the constraints of their situation, they were beginning to build something deeper than either of them could have predicted. As the days passed, Victoria found herself navigating an unfamiliar territory between the loyalty she had for her son, her deepening feelings for Kareem, and the realities of their contract. Every interaction with him, each shared look, every subtle gesture began to blur the lines of what they had originally agreed upon. What started as a business transaction, a lifeless arrangement to secure his family's legacy, was slowly transforming into something far more complex. She felt guilty for the emotions she was beginning to entertain. But could she really go back now? One evening, after another quiet dinner in the mansion, Victoria and Kareem sat on the terrace watching the city lights twinkle in the distance. The warmth from the fire pit did little to ease the tension between them, but the moment felt different. The air between them was heavy, pregnant with unspoken words. Kareem finally broke the silence, his voice steady but carrying the weight of something deeper. "Victoria," he began, his tone serious, "I've been thinking. I know we agreed on the terms of this arrangement, but lately I can't help but feel that this isn't what I want anymore." Her heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice trembling with uncertainty. "I don't want you to leave." "I don't want to lose this connection we've formed," he confessed, his eyes locking with hers. "I know this whole situation is difficult, but what we have, it feels real. I need you to know that it's not just about the child anymore." Victoria's breath caught in her chest. She could feel her walls crumbling, but she wasn't sure if she was ready to let go of the caution she had built around her heart. "But we've never discussed what happens after," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't have all the answers," Kareem admitted, "but I know this whatever happens. I don't want us to be strangers anymore." In that moment, Victoria realized that the future wasn't as uncertain as she thought. It was in her hands, and for the first time, she felt like it was okay to reach for something more. Victoria spent most of the next few days in a state of quiet reflection, the weight of Kareem's words lingering in her mind. She had always been so determined to keep things professional, to follow the contract and remain emotionally detached. But now, she wasn't sure she could. As the days passed, she couldn't ignore the growing connection between them, the subtle touches, the shared glances, and even the rare moments of kindness that Kareem had shown her. One afternoon, as she was in the library sorting through some documents, Kareem walked in, his usual commanding presence softened by an almost uncharacteristic warmth. "Victoria," he said gently, "we need to talk." She turned to face him, unsure of what to expect. "About what?" she asked, her voice steady but laced with a hint of nervousness. "I know this isn't easy for either of us." "I realized something," Kareem continued, taking a step closer. "When I agreed to this arrangement, I didn't anticipate how much you would mean to me. I didn't expect to care about you the way I do." Victoria felt a lump form in her throat. This was the first time he had admitted any vulnerability, and it startled her. "Kareem, we're not supposed to have feelings for each other." "This was just about the baby," she said, her voice barely a whisper. He nodded. But there was a fire in his eyes, a quiet intensity that made her heart race. "I know, but I can't deny what's growing between us. I can't keep pretending. Like I don't want something more." Victoria's heart pounded as she processed his words. She had never allowed herself to imagine a life beyond the terms of their agreement. But now, for the first time, she found herself wondering what it would be like to be with him outside the confines of their contract. "I don't know what to say," she replied, her voice shaky. "But I do know this: I'm scared. Scared of letting go, scared of what this could mean for me and my son." Kareem reached out, gently taking her hand. "I'm not asking you to make a decision right now. I want you to know I'm here. Whatever comes next, we'll face it together." And in that moment, Victoria realized that the future wasn't just about contracts and obligations. It was about finding the courage to open her heart and maybe, just maybe, to embrace a future she never saw coming. Over the following weeks, Victoria found herself navigating a delicate balance. She had come to terms with her emotions for Kareem, but her responsibility as a mother weighed heavily on her heart. The truth was, she had always put her son first, and that hadn't changed. Even though Kareem had shown her kindness and understanding, she was still hesitant about the future. She couldn't ignore the fact that her life had been shaped by sacrifice, and she wasn't sure if she was ready to let go of the control she had fought so hard to maintain. One evening, after a long day of meetings, Victoria stood by the window in the grand living room, staring out at the city lights. Kareem's presence had become a constant in her life, but it was clear that he wanted more than the contract, more than the obligations they had agreed upon. It was something that had started to unravel the careful walls she had built around herself. Kareem walked in quietly, as he often did, his footsteps soft on the marble floor. He stopped beside her, his eyes following her gaze out the window. "What are you thinking about?" he asked, his voice low and gentle, as though he understood the turmoil inside her. Victoria hesitated, unsure how to voice her conflicting feelings. "I'm thinking about what's next," she said, her voice barely audible. About the future. About Aiden. I can't keep living like this, divided between two worlds. Kareem turned to face her, his gaze intense, yet filled with empathy. Victoria, I've never asked you to give up your son, nor would I ever. But I believe there's more to life than just surviving nights about living. I want to live with you, with Aiden, in a way that feels real, without the weight of past decisions hanging over us. She looked at him, the truth of his words sinking in. Her heart ached with the weight of the decision she had yet to make. For the first time in a long while, she allowed herself to imagine a future where she wasn't just surviving, but truly living. The question now was whether she could take the leap and trust in it as the days passed. Victoria couldn't ignore the growing sense of change within herself. What began as a simple arrangement, a contract that had promised to keep her and her son safe, had now evolved into something far more complicated. She had never anticipated how deeply her connection with Kareem would grow, how his quiet gestures of kindness and his unspoken understanding would slowly chip away at the walls she had carefully constructed around her heart. But with every passing moment, the uncertainty about the future lingered. She spent her nights lying awake, staring at the ceiling, wrestling with the fears she couldn't shake. Could she truly build a future with Kareem, a man whose life had been defined by wealth and power, while hers had been molded by sacrifice and struggle? What did she really know about him beyond his calculated exterior? She had never allowed herself to trust anyone fully, and here she was, teetering on the edge of vulnerability. One evening, as they sat across from each other in the dining room, the air between them thick with unspoken words, Kareem finally broke the silence. "Victoria," he began, his voice low and steady, "I know you've been holding back, keeping parts of yourself closed off, and I understand why, but you need to know something, this, what we have. It's not just about the agreement we signed. It's about us, about what we can build together." Victoria looked at him, her breath caught in her throat. She had spent so many years protecting herself, shielding her heart from the possibility of disappointment. But as she saw the sincerity in his eyes, something in her shifted. She had spent so much of her life fearing what might happen if she allowed herself to trust someone else. But now, she was beginning to realize that her fears might not have to define her future. Could she take the leap? Could she let go of the past and embrace what lay ahead? For the first time, Victoria allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, the future could be something worth fighting for. Victoria couldn't help but feel a strange mixture of anticipation and fear as she stood at the edge of a new chapter in her life. The past few months had been a whirlwind of emotions, unexpected connections, and moments of deep introspection. What started as an arrangement, a way to secure a future for her son, had gradually evolved into something more, something that threatened to blur the lines between obligation and real emotion. As Kareem's presence in her life grew stronger, so did the pull of his intentions. He had been patient, considerate, in ways that Victoria hadn't expected. And though she had resisted, she began to feel the stirrings of something more profound between them. Still, the fear lingered, fear of trusting again, fear of losing control, and most of all, fear of making the wrong choice. One evening, as they sat together on the terrace, watching the sun dip below the horizon, Kareem spoke in a way that made Victoria's heart race. "You've carried the weight of the world on your shoulders for so long," he said softly, his voice breaking the stillness. "I know it's not easy, but I want you to know that you don't have to carry it alone anymore. We can face this together." His words pierced through her defenses, and for a fleeting moment, Victoria allowed herself to imagine a future where she wasn't alone. She had spent so many years battling life's challenges by herself, convinced that no one could ever truly understand her struggles. But there, sitting beside Kareem, something shifted inside her. The fear was still there, yes, but it was no longer as overwhelming. Maybe, just maybe, it was time to let go of her doubts and give herself the chance at something more. It wasn't an easy decision. But in that quiet moment, Victoria realized she was ready to embrace whatever came next, knowing that for the first time in a long while, she wasn't facing it alone. Victoria had always been fiercely independent, determined to carve out a future for her son on her own terms. But there, in the quiet luxury of the mansion, surrounded by unfamiliar comfort, she felt a shift. It wasn't just the house itself, the towering walls, the meticulously manicured gardens, but the subtle change in the air. The tension she had carried for years, the uncertainty that had been her constant companion, was beginning to lift. She wasn't sure when it happened, but somewhere along the way. Kareem's presence had become a stabilizing force in her life. At first, it had been the contractual nature of their arrangement that had kept her guarded. But now, it was the small, unexpected acts of kindness, his willingness to sit and listen, his rare smiles, the way he cared for those around him, that made her start to see him in a different light. Kareem had always kept his distance, treating her with an air of professionalism, but there were moments when his walls came down, like when he took her to the garden one afternoon, sharing stories of his own struggles, or when, after she mentioned missing her mother's cooking, he arranged for a chef to prepare her favorite dishes, an effort she couldn't help but appreciate. Still, the fear remained. Victoria had lived a life filled with disappointment and hardship, and the idea of trusting someone, especially someone like Kareem, felt like a leap of faith she wasn't ready to take. But as time passed, she found herself softening, allowing herself to be vulnerable, to let down the guard she'd held up for so long. One evening, as they sat together, a quiet understanding passed between them. For the first time, Victoria realized that the future she'd been so afraid of was no longer a burden. With Kareem by her side, maybe, just maybe, she could finally build the life she'd always dreamed of, a life that wasn't defined by fear, but by hope. As the story draws to a close, we are reminded that true strength comes not from standing alone, but from allowing ourselves to trust and lean on others. Victoria's journey from survival to self-discovery shows that even in the most uncertain circumstances, the power of love, understanding, and vulnerability can reshape our lives. Kareem's quiet support and Victoria's courageous choices built a foundation for a future filled with hope and new beginnings. The value of this story lies in its message of resilience and the importance of second chances, proving that even in the darkest moments, there is always room for growth, change, and the possibility of love. If you found inspiration in their journey, take a moment to reflect on your own life. Remember, you don't have to carry your burdens alone. There's always hope for a brighter tomorrow. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more heartwarming tales. Share your thoughts on Victoria and Kareem's journey below and let us know what you believe the future holds for them. Support means the world.